A cocky gate agent mocks Big Shaq for flying economy, thinking he's just another passenger in the cheap seats. But when the truth hits, that Shaq owns the airline, his smirk vanishes, and his career hangs by a thread. Some lessons come easy. Others, you never see them coming until it's too late. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The bustling JFK airport was alive with movement. Businessmen checking their watches, families clutching their boarding passes, and tired travelers hoping for an uneventful flight. Among them stood Big Shaq, towering over the crowd in the economy class line. He didn't mind the stares. Some passengers whispered to each other, recognizing him instantly, while others gave him puzzled looks, trying to place the familiar face. But Shaq wasn't here for attention. He just wanted to board his flight, settle in, and get home. The economy line inched forward, passengers shifting restlessly as they approached the check-in counter. Shaq adjusted the strap on his carry-on, standing patiently like everyone else. Then came the first scoff. A young gate agent, Adam, barely in his mid-20s, leaned over to his coworker and muttered something under his breath. A chuckle followed. Shaq heard it, but he let it slide. He was used to moments like this. "Excuse me, sir," Adam called out, his tone laced with amusement. "I think you're in the wrong line." Shaq turned to him, his deep brown eyes calm. "Nah, I'm good right here." The agent raised an eyebrow, barely suppressing a smirk. "You sure about that? This is economy class." Passengers behind Shaq shifted uncomfortably. Some had their phones out, pretending not to listen. Others exchanged knowing glances. Shaq nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." Adam let out a low chuckle. "Did your assistant book this by mistake?" "Happens sometimes. I mean, you of all people shouldn't be flying back here." A few passengers laughed under their breath. Others winced at the agent's cocky tone. Shaq didn't respond. He just waited. The line moved forward again. Shaq stepped up to the counter and handed over his boarding pass. Adam took it with a smirk, glancing at the seat assignment. "Wow, mupatanan gapi. That's a middle seat. You must really like suffering," he said, shaking his head dramatically. This time, a few passengers outright chuckled. Shaq smiled, but there was a weight behind it, one that only a few could see. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't angry, but he was watching. Adam tapped at his keyboard, still amused. "All right, Mr. O'Neill, I'll get you checked in." Then suddenly, his smirk faltered. Something on the screen froze him in place. Passengers fidgeted behind Shaq, growing impatient. But Adam's entire body had gone still. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, eyes locked on the monitor. Shaq said nothing. He simply waited. A woman in a crisp airline uniform, standing a few feet away, noticed the shift in Adam's demeanor. She stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" Adam swallowed, blinking at the screen. He didn't know what to say. Passengers murmured, sensing the sudden change in energy. Shaq just smiled. The moment of realization was coming, and he wasn't going to say a word. The tension in the line had shifted. The moment Adam's smirk faltered, the people around him felt it. Whispers spread through the waiting passengers like a slow-moving current, an unspoken shift in mood. Some still smirked, amused by the whole situation. An NBA legend standing in an economy class line, being treated like any other passenger. Others, especially those who recognized Big Shaq for more than just his fame, exchanged uncertain glances. A woman near the front of the line sighed. "Man, people just don't know when to keep their mouth shut." A few nodded in agreement, but no one spoke loudly. Most were too interested in seeing what happened next. And then, amid the silence, a small voice cut through. "Mom, that's Shaq. That's Shaq." Heads turned as a boy no older than 10 stood a few feet away, clutching his mother's hand with wide, excited eyes. He pulled at her sleeve, urging her forward. "Can I say hi? Can I ask for an autograph?" His mother hesitated, looking toward Shaq, then back at the airline staff. It was an awkward situation, and she didn't want to make it worse. But Shaq, standing in the center of the storm, just smiled. He bent down slightly, extending his massive hand toward the boy. "Come here, little man." The kid rushed forward without hesitation, grinning from ear to ear as he pulled out a crumpled notebook. "Can you sign this?" Shaq took it, flipping to a blank page. "What's your name?" "Caleb." Shaq scrawled a quick message. "Keep dreaming big, Caleb. Much love. Big Shaq." He handed the notebook back, ruffling the kid's hair. Caleb beamed, clutching the paper like it was a golden ticket. "Thank you." And just like that, the room shifted again. For the first time since Shaq had walked into the line, Adam looked uncomfortable. Because suddenly, he wasn't just mocking some tall guy in an economy seat. He was mocking a person people admired. A person who made kids' faces light up. A few of the other passengers shifted, as if realizing the same thing. The laughter faded, replaced by a heavier kind of silence. But Adam, still standing at the counter, didn't back down. If anything, he doubled down. "So what, man? You think signing a kid's notebook changes anything?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "It's still weird. A guy like you flying economy? That just doesn't happen." This time, a few passengers frowned. A woman near the back muttered, "Dude, just give him his boarding pass and move on." But Adam wasn't done. The attention had already been on him, and now it felt like a challenge. He let out a short, loud laugh, glancing toward his co-workers for support. "I mean, really, what happened? Lost a bet? You're not broke, are you?" Shaq didn't respond. Not yet. Because just behind Adam, a figure had stepped forward. She was dressed in a crisp navy blazer, her ID badge clipped neatly at her hip. Her dark brown eyes flickered between the screen and Adam's stiffened posture. She had been watching, and now she had seen enough. But she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she simply observed. Shaq noticed her presence but said nothing. He was waiting. And something about the way she stood, silent and unreadable, made it clear. Adam's night was about to change. For Shaq, moments like these weren't new. Fame came with assumptions. People thought they knew him. They saw the basketball legend, the millionaire, the celebrity with endorsements and investments. What they didn't see was where he came from. He was 8 years old the first time he saw his mother cry over an unpaid bill. It was just the two of them at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out in front of her. He had been too young to understand interest rates and overdue notices, but he understood what it meant when his mother rubbed her temples, exhaling like the weight of the world had settled onto her shoulders. He remembered saying, "I'll buy you a house one day, Mama. The biggest one ever." She had smiled through her exhaustion, ruffling his hair. "Baby, you don't gotta buy me nothing. Just grow up to be a good man." A good man. That was all she ever asked. Not rich, not famous, just good. And so, even now, standing in an airport where a gate agent was trying to make him feel small, Shaq kept his mother's words close. Because ego didn't make a man great. Humility did. And right now, the man in front of him, he had a lot to learn. Back in the present, Adam let out another forced laugh, trying to keep control of the moment. He waved toward the passengers like they were in on some kind of joke. "I mean, come on, man. What's next? Are you gonna tell me you own this airline?" He joked, nudging his coworker beside him. The coworker didn't laugh. Neither did anyone else. The only sound was the quiet tapping of a woman's fingernail against a clipboard. Adam turned slightly, finally noticing her presence. The moment he saw her ID badge, his entire posture changed. Her nameplate read, Elena Carter, Director of Customer Experience. And judging by the way she was staring at him, she had heard every single word. Elena tilted her head slightly, glancing at the computer screen, then back to Shaq, then back to Adam. "Is there a problem?" she asked, voice smooth but sharp. Adam froze. The color drained from his face, his bravado, his smirking confidence, gone in an instant. Because something on the screen wasn't normal. And judging by Elena's expression, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Shaq still didn't speak. He just watched it all unfold. The whispers in the line turned into silence. Passengers who had once chuckled now leaned forward, sensing the shift in power. Adam swallowed hard, hands trembling slightly as he tried to gather himself. And then, for the first time, His voice shook. I didn't know. But it was already too late. Because now, the truth was about to come out. And it was going to change everything. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his economy-class boarding pass, handing it over without a word. Adam, still standing behind the counter, accepted it with a smirk, spinning it between his fingers like it was a joke instead of a travel document. The arrogance hadn't faded from his face. If anything, it had doubled down after his forced laughter. He glanced at his coworkers as if waiting for them to join in. "Man, this just keeps getting better," Adam said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. 7'1", built like a tank, worth millions, and you're crammed in a middle seat in economy? A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between Shaq and the agent. Some looked like they wanted to step in, but no one spoke. One man, holding his phone at chest level, subtly hit record. Shaq noticed it all, but his expression remained the same, calm, unbothered. Let them talk. Let them record. He had nothing to prove. Adam, oblivious to the growing tension, tapped a few keys on his keyboard and scanned Shaq's ticket. The machine beeped twice, then flashed red. Error. Adam frowned. He scanned it again. Another red flash. The smirk began to slip. Shaq said nothing, waiting. Passengers watched closely, sensing the shift. Adam tapped a few more keys, trying to override whatever was happening, but the screen didn't change. His fingers stiffened against the keyboard. His confidence wavered. The silence stretched. Then, just when Adam looked like he was about to try again, a voice cut through the tension. "Let me see that." Elena Carter. The director of customer experience, still standing nearby, stepped forward. Her sharp, assessing eyes locked onto the boarding pass. Adam swallowed hard. Elena extended a hand. Adam hesitated before reluctantly placing the boarding pass in her grasp. She flipped it over, her eyes scanning the details, then looked at the computer screen. A pause. A slow breath. And then, her entire demeanor changed. Adam, standing beside her, could see the information on the monitor. His face went pale. The passengers watched as something shifted in the air. Elena turned to Shaq, her voice smooth but carrying an undeniable weight. "Sir, would you mind stepping aside for just a moment?" Not a request, a directive. And that's when everything changed. Shaq nodded and took a step back, slipping his boarding pass back into his pocket. He wasn't in a hurry. The gate area had gone dead silent. Adam, now visibly sweating, leaned in slightly, his voice lowered but still audible to the closest passengers. Is there an issue with the ticket?" Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the screen slightly, just enough so Adam could get a clear view of what was written there. His breath hitched. Shaq watched the younger man's shoulders tense, his fingers twitch against the counter. Elena finally spoke, her tone even but dripping with unspoken authority. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" Adam flinched. I mean, of course. I know who he is," he stammered. "It's Shaquille O'Neal. NBA, endorsements, whatever. I just thought it was weird he was flying economy, that's all." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "Is that all you thought?" Adam had no answer. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time, he realized he might have made a mistake that couldn't be undone. Passengers whispered among themselves, some still recorded. The energy in the room had completely shifted. Shaq didn't move, didn't speak, because now, it wasn't his move to make. Elena exhaled slowly, setting down the boarding pass before turning to Adam fully. She was done playing along. "You really should have read the notes attached to his ticket," she said. "Instead, you decided to entertain yourself at his expense." Adam's stomach dropped. "Notes?" he echoed, his voice weak. Elena nodded. She turned back to Shaq, her expression unreadable. "Sir, I just need to confirm something before we proceed. Would you like to handle this personally, or shall I?" Shaq gave a small smile, but there was something in his eyes that made Adam's pulse race. "I think you got it covered," Shaq said, his voice smooth. "I'm just enjoying the show." A nervous laugh rippled through the passengers. Adam's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in fear. Because he knew. He had screwed up, Badly. Elena turned back to Adam, her tone still professional but cutting. "Let me make this very clear," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Mr. O'Neill is not just a passenger, he is—" A pause, a flicker of hesitation, then the final blow. One of the primary shareholders in this airline. A ripple of shock spread through the waiting area. Passengers gasped. A few audibly said, "No way." Adam's mouth opened and closed, words failing him completely. Elena didn't stop. She wanted the lesson to sink in. "He is, in part, your employer," she continued. "The man you just publicly mocked has more power over your career than you can even begin to understand." Adam felt his entire body go cold. Because now, it wasn't just an awkward situation. It was a career-ending one. Adam stepped back instinctively, his mind racing. Everything he had said, every smirk, every condescending remark, all directed at a man who could have him removed with a single phone call. The thought made his knees feel weak. The passengers were no longer laughing. Now they were waiting, watching. Would Shaq retaliate? Would he demand that Adam be fired? But Shaq? He didn't move. He just watched, his expression unreadable. Adam swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." Elena didn't give him an inch of room. "No, you didn't," she said coldly. "And yet you felt comfortable humiliating him in front of all these people." Adam's face burned with shame. Shaq finally exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly before glancing at Elena. "So, what now?" Elena straightened. "That's entirely up to you, sir." Shaq looked back at Adam, studying him for a long moment. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was something far worse. Disappointment. Adam felt it. It cut deeper than anger ever could. Shaq let the silence hang for a moment longer before finally speaking. "I don't need an apology," he said, his voice even. "I don't need anything, really. But you? You might want to think about how you treat people." Adam nodded stiffly, his face red, his ego shattered. Shaq turned back to Elena. "Can I board now?" Elena nodded immediately. "Right this way, sir." And with that, Big Shaq walked away, leaving Adam to sit in the wreckage of his own choices. Passengers turned back to their seats, their eyes still lingering on Adam, who stood frozen behind the counter. Because for the first time in his life, he had laughed at the wrong man. And this time, it had cost him everything. Passengers, who had been whispering among themselves moments ago, now watched in complete silence. There was something about the way the energy shifted. Like everyone had sensed the moment when things had stopped being funny and started becoming serious. Shaq stood there, hands resting lightly on his suitcase handle, his expression calm but knowing. He wasn't tense. He wasn't rattled. He had been here before, seen this play out in different forms, in different places, in different ways. But this was about to get interesting. Elena Carter, the airline's director of customer experience, had taken control of the situation, standing at the counter as she quietly examined the computer screen. The information in front of her had clearly told her something that no one else knew, yet. Adam, the young gate agent, had gone noticeably stiff beside her. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breathing had gone uneven, and his once cocky smirk had completely vanished. Still, he tried to recover, tried to salvage the moment. "So, Adam swallowed, his voice lower now. "Is there, an issue with the ticket? Or—" Elena didn't respond right away. Instead, she slowly straightened, adjusting the clipboard in her hands. Then, without taking her eyes off the screen, she said, "Step over here." It wasn't a request. Adam hesitated. The passengers around them noticed the shift in her tone. It wasn't just professional, it was decisive. Final. Elena turned slightly, her sharp brown eyes locking onto Adam's. "Now." Adam let out a nervous breath and stepped away from the counter. The murmurs among the passengers picked up again, hushed but unmistakable. Something was happening, and everyone could feel it. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned toward the person next to him. "What the hell's going on?" "I don't know," the other man muttered, "but that kid looks like he's about to faint." Adam walked a few steps to the side, where Elena turned toward him. She lowered her voice, but the intensity in her words didn't change. "Do you have any idea who you've been talking to?" Adam blinked rapidly, still pretending not to know where this was going. "I mean, yeah, obviously," he said, trying to inject even the slightest bit of confidence back into his voice. "He's Shaquille O'Neal. NBA, movies, endorsements, all that. Everyone knows who he is." Elena stared at him for a long moment, her silence somehow louder than the entire terminal full of people. Then she let out a quiet breath through her nose. "Wow," she muttered. "You really don't get it, do you?" Adam opened his mouth, but before he could speak, she tilted the monitor slightly, just enough so that he could see what she was seeing. And just like that, his entire body locked up. His eyes darted across the screen, reading information that should have been impossible. His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His skin went pale. Elena gave him a moment to let it sink in before leaning in, just enough so that only he could hear her next words. "You just mocked one of the airline's largest shareholders." Adam stopped breathing. Shaq, still standing by the counter, watched the entire moment unfold. He didn't need to hear the conversation to know exactly what was being said. He had seen that expression before, that exact combination of horror, regret, and realization. Adam's back had gone rigid, his hands curling slightly at his sides. His entire posture screamed panic. The passengers weren't stupid. They had been watching this whole thing from the beginning, and they could see the way Adam's body language had changed. The arrogance, gone, the confidence, shattered. And yet, Shaq still hadn't said a word. A woman with red glasses leaned toward a man in a hoodie. "Dude, what do you think is happening right now?" The man shook his head, eyes glued to the scene in front of him. "I don't know," he murmured. "But that kid looks like he's about to throw up." Elena took a step back, letting Adam fully process what had just happened. Then, after a long pause, she delivered the final blow. "You might want to rethink how you treat people," she said simply. "Because the next time you decide to laugh at someone's ticket, you might be laughing at the person who signs your paycheck." A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Oh, he's done." Shaq lowered his head slightly, hiding a small smile. Not out of amusement, not out of revenge, but because he had seen this lesson play out before, and Adam was learning it the hard way. Adam took a shaky breath, his brain racing to find a way out of the mess he had created. I didn't know," he whispered. Elena raised a brow. "And that excuses your behavior?" Adam's mouth snapped shut. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Elena turned back toward Shaq, her expression professional once more. "Mr. O'Neal, I sincerely apologize for this experience. It was completely unacceptable." Shaq, still calm as ever, simply nodded. "I get it," he said. "But I'm not looking for an apology." Elena tilted her head. "Then what are you looking for?" Shaq finally looked at Adam, holding his gaze for the first time since this whole thing had started. And then, with a voice smooth but firm, he said, "I just wanted to see how far he was going to take it." Adam's heart nearly stopped. Because now? He realized that Shaq had been in control of this situation the entire time. And somehow, that was more terrifying than anything else. A heavy silence settled over the gate. Passengers, once just amused spectators, were now sitting on the edge of something they didn't quite understand yet. Something had shifted, something unseen but undeniable, and it all revolved around the towering man standing calmly by the counter. Shaquille O'Neal. Not just a passenger, not just a celebrity, something more. Adam, the gate agent who had been laughing moments ago, now stood completely frozen. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his mind struggling to process the weight of what he had just been told. "You just mocked your boss," Elena Carter, the airline's director of customer experience, whispered. Adam's body went rigid. Shaq said nothing. He didn't need to. He just stood there, watching, as realization sank in like a slow-moving storm. Adam blinked rapidly, trying to force out some kind of response, an apology, an excuse, anything that might undo what had already been done. But nothing came. Because what do you even say after something like that? Passengers, sensing the gravity of the moment, were dead silent. Some still had their phones out, but now they weren't recording out of amusement. They were recording because they knew they were witnessing something huge, a lesson, a reckoning, and Adam was at the center of it. For months, Shaq had been making quiet, calculated moves. He had spent a lifetime in front of cameras, his career stretching beyond basketball, endorsements, businesses, partnerships, investments. But this was personal. 1 year ago, on a flight from Miami to Los Angeles, he had witnessed an elderly couple being mistreated by an airline employee. They had been confused about their tickets, struggling to understand the seating arrangement, and the agent had dismissed them without a second thought. Shaq had stepped in, offered them his first-class seat, and taken their economy row instead. Not because he had to, not because anyone was watching, but because he remembered his mother's words. Be a good man. That experience had stuck with him. It made him think. What if he could change the way people were treated at airlines? What if he could ensure that the name on the company meant more than just business? It meant respect. So months later, he did something that no one saw coming. He bought in. Not just a minor investment. Not just a small seat at the table. A majority stake. He kept the deal quiet, his lawyers ensuring the press wouldn't leak the details until the right moment. And now, that moment had arrived. Adam's breathing had turned shallow. His mind replayed everything. Every smirk, every joke, every condescending remark he had made over the last 15 minutes. The world around him felt too small now, as if the air itself had thinned, making it impossible to breathe. You're lying, Adam finally muttered, but his voice held no conviction. Elena turned the screen slightly toward him again, as if to say, see for yourself. Adam's eyes scanned the words, his lips parting slightly. The information was right in front of him. Shaquille O'Neal, primary shareholder, major stakeholder, executive advisor. His hands clenched at his sides. This wasn't just some VIP traveler who got a few perks here and there. This man had the power to erase Adam's entire career with a single phone call. And he had mocked him. Publicly. A bead of sweat formed at Adam's temple. He wanted to disappear. Passengers were still watching, waiting for Shaq to say something, waiting for the moment he would drop the hammer. But Shaq didn't move, didn't react. He just let Adam drown in the weight of his own choices. For Shaq, this wasn't about revenge. It never had been. He had seen people like Adam before, young, arrogant, so sure that they knew the world, that they were untouchable in their own little corner of it. He wasn't angry, but he was disappointed. And in moments like these, silence was far louder than words. The passengers were restless now, shifting in their seats, glancing between Shaq and Adam like they were waiting for a final verdict. Some thought Shaq would explode, demand Adam be fired on the spot. Others thought he might make an example of him, call security, or send an email that would have Adam packing his desk by the end of the night. But he did none of those things. Instead, he simply turned to Elena and said, "Let's wrap this up. I got a flight to catch." Adam's chest heaved with shallow breaths. He wanted to speak, to fix this, to apologize, to do something that might make this nightmare end. But what was left to say? He had laughed at the wrong man. And now, the whole world knew it. Elena finally spoke, her tone measured. "Mr. O'Neal, your seat has been upgraded to first class, of course. It was already in your file." Shaq smiled slightly. "Appreciate it, but I'll stay in economy." Elena hesitated. "Are you sure?" Shaq nodded, glancing toward the waiting area. "This ain't about where I sit," he said. "It's about how people are treated, no matter where they sit." The weight of that statement settled over everyone within earshot. A few passengers clapped quietly. Others simply watched Shaq with newfound respect. Not just for who he was, but for what he stood for. Adam? He just stood there, silent, knowing that this moment would follow him for a long, long time. Shaq took his boarding pass, gave a small nod to Elena, and turned toward the gate. And as he walked past Adam, he didn't even look at him. Because some lessons, you have to learn on your own. Shaq sat near the gate, his massive frame somehow folded comfortably into the standard airport chair. The energy in the terminal had shifted. People weren't laughing anymore. They weren't whispering behind his back. They were thinking. Adam, the gate agent who had spent the last 15 minutes mocking him, now stood frozen behind the counter, staring down at the floor as if he could will himself out of existence. Shaq said nothing. He had never needed to. Because silence, when placed in the right hands, carried more weight than any words ever could. But as he sat there, waiting for his flight to board, his mind drifted, backward, to a different time, to a different moment in his life when he, too, had to learn a lesson about what it meant to be humbled. Shaquille O'Neal had been a giant from the start. Even as a kid, he had towered over his classmates, always the biggest, always the strongest. At 12 years old, he was already dunking on hoops in the neighborhood, already being called a future NBA star by local coaches. And he knew it. He knew he was stronger than the other kids. He knew people treated him differently because of it, and sometimes, when no one was watching, he let it get to his head. One summer afternoon, when he was 13, a group of kids were playing basketball on the neighborhood court. Shaq, fresh off a growth spurt, was unstoppable. They couldn't guard him. They couldn't block him. They couldn't do anything to stop him from winning. And Shaq? He made sure they knew it. Every time he scored, he taunted them. Every time he blocked a shot, he laughed. Every time he grabbed a rebound, he made a show of it, flexing his arms, making the smaller kids feel even smaller. To him, it wasn't mean. It was just funny. Then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the court like a blade. "Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal, get over here." His heart dropped. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, stood at the edge of the court, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The other kids went silent. Shaq, suddenly feeling very small despite his height, trudged toward her. She didn't speak as she walked him home. She didn't yell. She didn't even look at him. And that was worse than anything else. When they got inside, she finally turned to him, her eyes filled with a disappointment that made his chest feel tight. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Shaq shifted on his feet. "Do what?" Her eyes narrowed. "Son, don't play dumb with me. I saw you. You didn't just play better than them. You made sure they felt worse than you." Shaq exhaled, rolling his eyes. "Mom, I was just what?" she snapped. "Just proving you're bigger? Stronger? You think that makes you special?" Shaq clenched his jaw. "Maybe." Lucille shook her head. "You want to know what makes a man special?" Shaq didn't answer. His mother stepped forward, pressing a hand against his massive chest. "It ain't size. It ain't strength. It's what you do with it." Shaq looked down at the floor. "You were given a gift, Shaquille. But if you use it to make people feel small instead of lifting them up, then you're not a man. You're just a bully." The words stung, because deep down, he knew she was right. That night he barely slept. The next day he went back to the neighborhood court, but this time, he played differently. He encouraged the smaller kids. He gave them chances to shoot. He lifted them up instead of tearing them down. And you know what happened? He still won. Because winning doesn't mean breaking people. It means being better without making others feel worse. That lesson? It never left him. Years later, when Shaq was 16, he had his first real taste of what it meant to be judged not by his talent, not by his kindness, but by his skin. It was during a basketball tournament in Texas. His team had traveled for an away game, and Shaq was fired up. He had been playing the best ball of his life, dunking over defenders, dominating the court like he was born for it. Then, after the game, as the team walked toward the locker room, he heard it. A voice. Loud. Mocking. "Ain't no way that boy's only 16. You sure he ain't fresh off a plantation?" Shaq froze. The air around him felt different. He turned his head, locking eyes with a group of white men in the stands, their smirks unmistakable. His fists clenched. His pulse pounded in his ears. But before he could even take a step, his coach's hand landed on his shoulder. "Let it go, big man." Shaq couldn't move. For the first time in his life, All his strength, all his size, meant nothing. He wasn't angry. He was hurt. And in that moment, he understood something. Power isn't about how big you are. It's about how you carry it. And from that day on, he carried it with humility. The memory faded as Shaq sat in his airport chair, his gaze fixed on Adam. The young agent still hadn't moved, his face pale, his hands twitching against the counter. The entire gate area was silent. Passengers weren't laughing anymore. They weren't whispering behind their hands. They were waiting. Waiting to see if Adam would apologize. Waiting to see if Shaq would lash out, demand justice, get the man fired on the spot. But Shaq? He just sat there. Because he didn't need to do anything. The lesson had already been taught. Adam's chest rose and fell quickly, his breathing uneven. He looked up at Shaq for a brief second, just long enough for their eyes to meet. And in that moment, Shaq saw it, the realization, the shame, the regret. He had seen it before, because once upon a time, he had been in Adam's shoes too. And sometimes the hardest lesson of all is learning that power doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you responsible. Shaq leaned back, exhaling. The job was done. Now it was up to Adam to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be. And that wasn't Shaq's decision to make. Adam's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His world had shrunk to the space between him and Shaquille O'Neal. Just minutes ago, he had been laughing, cracking jokes, feeling untouchable behind the counter. Now, he could barely stand straight. His palms were slick with sweat. His mind scrambled for a way out, for something, anything, that might undo what had already been done. I didn't know, Adam stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Shaq just looked at him, and that was worse than anything else. Because it wasn't anger in his expression, it wasn't gloating, it was something far worse, disappointment. All around them, passengers had their phones out, recording everything. Adam could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting, capturing his downfall in crystal clear HD. A middle-aged man in a gray hoodie was speaking into his phone like a commentator at a boxing match. Y'all, this dude is done. Shaq about to own his whole life. A woman in a leather jacket nudged her friend. You think he's gonna get fired? Please, her friend muttered. He's lucky if he even makes it out of here with a job at all. The reality hit Adam like a freight train. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment in front of a few people. This was about to go viral. His face, his name, his arrogance, all of it was about to be plastered across social media, on news sites, in articles titled, Gate Agent Laughs at Shaq, Instantly Regrets It. His stomach twisted. But then, before the moment could spiral any further, Shaq did something no one expected. He lifted a hand. Calm, steady, commanding. Put the phones down. The words were soft but powerful. And just like that, people listened. The phones lowered. The whispers faded. Even the man in the hoodie muttered, "Damn, that's different," before clicking his phone off. Shaq didn't want humiliation. He wanted something else. And Adam, who had braced himself for a storm, now stood in the middle of something far more terrifying. A lesson. Shaq took a deep breath, his massive frame, towering over Adam, but there was no hostility in his presence. "Let me ask you something," Shaq said, voice steady. "You like your job?" Adam blinked, caught off guard. What? "Your job," Shaq repeated. "You like it?" Adam's throat felt dry. Yeah, I don't know." Shaq gave a slow nod. "See, that's the thing. You don't know." Adam's fingers twitched against his sides. He had no idea where this was going. Shaq glanced at Elena, then back at Adam. "I could have you fired," Shaq said casually. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Adam's pulse spiked. Passengers inhaled sharply, their gazes bouncing between the two men like a high-stakes game of poker. Shaq continued. "I could make one call, and this whole thing, your whole career, gone." Adam swallowed hard. "But I'm not going to do that," Shaq said simply. Adam blinked. Passengers stilled. Elena tilted her head slightly, clearly waiting for Shaq's next move. And then, Shaq did the unexpected. You want to keep your job? Shaq asked. Adam nodded so fast it almost looked painful. All right, Shaq said. Then here's the deal. Adam's breath hitched. You walk with me, Shaq said. One day. Just one. Adam's brows knitted together. What? Shaq's voice was firm. You spend one day with me. See how I treat people. See how I talk to them. See how I move. Adam's lips parted slightly, stunned. I ain't asking you to be my fan, Shaq said. I ain't asking you to like me. But you gonna learn something today. And after that, you do whatever you want with what you learn. Silence. Passengers held their breath. Adam stood frozen, his mind still playing catch-up. Shaq extended a massive hand. Deal? Adam looked at the hand, hesitating. He should have felt relief. He should have felt gratitude. But what he felt instead? Fear. Because if he accepted, he would have to face the truth. And that was harder than any punishment Shaq could have given him. Adam stared at Shaq's hand. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. His ego screamed at him to refuse. But something deeper, something more human, told him that this was his only way forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Adam lifted his trembling hand and shook Shaq's. Deal, he whispered. Shaq nodded once, firm but without arrogance. Good, Shaq said. Let's get started. Adam's stomach turned, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was ready to see the world the way it was meant to be seen. Adam had never felt this out of place before. Just a few hours ago, he had been the one with control, the one behind the counter, deciding who boarded with ease and who got attitude. Now, he was standing beside Shaquille O'Neal, following him through the airport like a lost intern on his first day of work. No badge to hide behind. No counter to shield him. Just him and the man whose respect he had thrown away without a second thought. And the worst part? He still didn't understand why Shaq was doing this. Shaq walked with an easy confidence, his pace steady, unrushed. He moved through the terminal like a man who saw everything but was in a hurry for nothing. Adam trailed behind him, still tense, still confused. Then out of nowhere, Shaq veered off course. Adam watched as Shaq approached an elderly janitor who was mopping a section near the restrooms. The man was in his late 60s, his back slightly hunched from years of labor. His uniform was faded, his hands rough from handling cleaning chemicals every day. Shaq stopped in front of him, waiting until the man looked up. Mornin', boss. How you doing today? Shaq asked, his deep voice carrying warmth. The janitor blinked, caught off guard. His eyes darted between Shaq's towering frame and the genuine smile on his face. Oh. I'm good, the man said, straightening slightly. Shaq nodded. What's your name, sir? The janitor hesitated before answering, as if he wasn't used to people caring. Larry. Larry, that's a strong name. You been working here long? Larry gave a small chuckle. Almost 20 years. Shaq whistled low. That's real work right there, keeping this place running. Bet you see everything that goes on in this airport, huh? Larry shook his head with a smile. More than I'd like. Shaq laughed. I feel you on that. Then, without warning, he stuck out his massive hand. I just want to say thanks, man. For real. You do a job most people don't even notice. But I see you. You keep this place moving, and I appreciate that. Larry hesitated for a moment, like he wasn't sure if this was real. Then slowly, he reached out and shook Shaq's hand. And for the first time since the conversation started, Adam felt something shift inside him. Because Larry's smile wasn't just polite, it was real. The kind of smile a man gives when he's been seen for the first time in years. And that did something to Adam. They kept walking. Shaq moved through the airport with purpose, but not like a man rushing to a flight. He moved like someone who knew exactly where he was supposed to be. At one point, he took a turn that Adam didn't expect, heading toward an employees-only area near baggage claim. Adam hesitated. Are we allowed back here? Shaq shot him a look. You work here, don't you? Adam clamped his mouth shut and followed. Inside, the baggage handlers were in the middle of their usual grind, hauling suitcases, checking tags, making sure bags got where they needed to go. It was loud, chaotic, and filled with the kind of sweat and exhaustion that most travelers never even think about. And Shaq? He fit right in. He walked straight up to a younger guy, maybe in his mid-20s, who was hauling a massive duffel bag onto a conveyor belt. "That one's gotta be at least 70 pounds, huh?" Shaq said, nodding toward the bag. The worker looked up, about to give a quick response. Then his brain fully registered who was talking to him. "Holy..." The guy stumbled back, nearly dropping the next suitcase. "You're..." Shaq grinned. "I know. I get that a lot." A few of the baggage handlers started gathering around, the energy shifting from exhaustion to excitement. Shaq fist-bumped each of them, taking time to actually talk, not just about sports, but about them. "Y'all work harder than half the people in this airport, and nobody even thinks about it. That ain't right." One of the handlers, a woman with short dreadlocks, grinned. "Try telling that to my paycheck." Shaq let out a deep laugh, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of crisp $100 bills. He didn't make a scene about it. Didn't wave it around. Just handed it to her like it was nothing. "Lunch on me today. For all y'all." The woman's eyes widened. The rest of the handlers stared in shock. "Adam?" He felt his stomach tighten, not because of the money, but because of the way it was given. Shaq wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't making some grand gesture. He was just giving respect where it was due. And that was starting to mess with Adam in a way he wasn't ready for. Later, as they sat in the airport's employee cafeteria, Adam found himself staring at Shaq, not in fear, not in awe, in confusion. Finally, he spoke. "Why do you do all this?" Shaq didn't look up from his food. "Do what?" "This," Adam gestured vaguely. "The janitor, the baggage handlers, the way you talk to people." Shaq chewed thoughtfully, then set down his fork. "Let me ask you something." Adam tensed. "What do you think power is?" Shaq asked. Adam blinked. "What?" "Power, man. You was acting like you had some earlier behind that counter. So tell me, what does power mean to you?" Adam hesitated. Then quietly, he admitted, "I thought power meant being above people." Shaq nodded as if he expected that answer. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Power ain't about being above people. It's about how many people you can pull up with you." Adam stopped breathing for a second, because he had never thought about it that way before. Not once. And now, he wasn't sure if he could ever unsee it. As they made their way back toward the terminal, Adam's mind raced. Everything he thought he knew about status, about control, about what it meant to be important, it all felt wrong now. Because real power, it wasn't in a job title. It wasn't in a uniform. It wasn't in how many people had to listen to you. It was in how many people you actually listened to. And Shaq? He had been listening this entire time. Adam had just been too blind to see it. But now he wasn't so sure he could ever look at the world the same way again. Adam sat across from Shaq in the quietest corner of the airport lounge. His mind was a mess, filled with the conversations, moments, and lessons from the past few hours. The janitor, the baggage handlers, the way Shaq spoke to people like they mattered, like their jobs weren't invisible. And for the first time, Adam wasn't just watching, he was thinking. But there was still one thing gnawing at him. Why did Shaq even care? Why did he, a man worth hundreds of millions, still go out of his way to treat people the way he did? Why hadn't he just taken his revenge when he had the chance? Why was this the lesson he chose to teach? Shaq sat back, sipping on his water. He must have sensed the thoughts running through Adam's head because he finally spoke. "You ever hear about the time I got kicked out of a jewelry store?" Adam blinked. "What?" Shaq set his cup down. "Years ago, back when I was fresh in the NBA, I walked into this fancy jewelry store," Shaq said, tapping his fingers against the table. "Had money in my pocket. Knew exactly what I wanted to buy. But you know what happened?" Adam shook his head. Shaq's jaw clenched slightly, but his voice stayed steady. "The manager came out, looked me up and down, and said, 'We don't think you can afford anything in here.'" Adam swallowed hard. "I laughed at first." Shaq continued. "Thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He told me I had to leave." Adam's stomach twisted. What did you do? He asked quietly. Shaq exhaled. I left. Adam frowned. That's it? Shaq nodded. That's it. Adam couldn't wrap his head around it. You didn't fight it? You didn't tell him who you were? Shaq let out a small chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Oh, he knew who I was, Shaq said. Didn't matter. Adam didn't know what to say. Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. His voice dropped just a little, carrying a weight Adam couldn't ignore. You ever had someone look you in the eye and decide, right then and there, that you don't belong? Adam hesitated. He had never thought about it like that. Never had to. Shaq sat back again, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. That wasn't the first time, he said. Wasn't the last either. Adam's throat felt dry. He had seen racism on TV, heard stories about it, but he had never been forced to sit with it like this. Shaq continued, voice calm but firm. Let me tell you something, man. You don't know how many times I've been followed in a store. How many times I've had people assume I was up to no good. How many times someone clutched their purse tighter when I walked by. Adam's chest tightened. Because he had done that before. Not to Shaq, but to others. People he didn't know. People who had never done anything to him. People he had judged before they even had a chance to prove him wrong. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then, without a hint of anger, he said, I saw your face when you realized who I was. Adam's fingers curled slightly against the table. I saw the way you changed. Adam felt sick, because Shaq was right. When he thought Shaq was just another economy-class passenger, he had treated him like less. But the second he realized the truth, the second he realized Shaq was powerful, he had panicked. Because it had never been about respect. It had been about status. And now, Adam was forced to see it. For the first time since this all started, Adam felt the need to explain himself, not to make excuses, but to be honest. He took a shaky breath. I was bullied growing up. Shaq didn't react. He just listened. Adam stared down at his hands. I wasn't always like this, he admitted. I used to be small, weak, easy to pick on. He swallowed, forcing himself to keep going. Kids used to push me around, take my lunch money, call me names. I'd go home with bruises and my mom would just say, toughen up, the world doesn't care about weak people. Shaq nodded slowly, letting him talk. Adam clenched his jaw. So I did. I toughened up. I stopped letting people walk all over me. I decided if I was going to be small, I was going to make up for it by being. He hesitated. Shaq finished for him. Above people. Adam exhaled sharply. Because yeah, that was the truth. If he couldn't be big, if he couldn't be strong, then at least he could be in a position where no one could make him feel small again. But now he was the one doing the pushing. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then he said, I get it. Adam looked up, startled. I do, Shaq continued. I get what it's like to want respect, to want power. Adam's chest tightened. But let me tell you something, Shaq said, leaning in slightly. You know what real power is? Adam didn't answer. Shaq's voice was steady, strong. It's not about making people feel small. It's about making people feel seen. Adam felt like he had been punched in the gut. Because he knew, deep down, he had spent his whole life doing the opposite. And for the first time, he hated himself for it. Shaq let the silence sit for a moment. Then he leaned back, crossing his arms. You can be better than what you showed today. Adam swallowed hard. You can walk out of here and keep being the guy who laughs at people he thinks are beneath him, Shaq continued. Or you can be the guy who actually sees people. Adam's throat tightened, because deep down, he knew there was only one real choice. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded. I don't want to be that guy anymore. Shaq studied him, then gave a slow nod. Good, he said. Then prove it. Adam exhaled sharply, because he would. He had to. Not for Shaq, not for his job, but for himself. And for the first time in his life, he finally understood what that meant. Adam stood at the gate, his mind still tangled in everything that had happened over the last few hours. He had started the day mocking a man he thought was beneath him. Now, he was standing next to that same man, completely unsure of who he was anymore. Shaq glanced at him, then handed over his own boarding pass to the gate agent. "I made a small change to the seating," he said casually. The new gate agent, a woman who had clearly been briefed on what had happened earlier, nodded quickly, scanning the ticket. "Of course, Mr. O'Neill. You'll be in your original seat, and your guest." She glanced at Adam, a flicker of surprise in her expression. "Will be in 3A. Adam frowned. "Wait, that's business class." Shaq gave a small nod. "Yep." Adam blinked. "But I..." Shaq stepped aside to let another passenger board. "Let's go. Flight ain't gonna wait for you." Adam hesitated, his instincts screaming that this had to be some kind of test. And deep down, he knew it was. With a tight breath, he grabbed his bag and walked through the gate, stepping into a world he had never belonged to before. Adam slid into seat 3A, his hands stiff as he fastened his seatbelt. The chair was huge, wide, leather, so comfortable it didn't even feel like an airplane seat. A flight attendant immediately appeared beside him, offering a warm smile. "Would you like a drink before takeoff?" she asked. Adam hesitated. He usually didn't get treated like this. Back in economy, he was used to waiting in long lines, getting a small plastic cup if the flight attendants weren't too busy. But here, they were treating him like he mattered, like he was important. And for the first time, he felt uncomfortable with it. He glanced toward Shaq, who had settled into his economy class seat by choice. The giant of a man barely fit in the row, his knees pressed slightly against the seat in front of him, but he didn't complain. Instead, he laughed, talked with the passengers around him like they were old friends, took photos with a little girl sitting 2 rows back, even letting her try on his massive championship ring. Adam watched it all happen, silent. And then, like a slow-growing ache, realization hit him. Adam had spent years thinking that business class, first class, power, meant something. That it was something to chase, something to hold on to, something that made you better than the people in the cheap seats. But now he sat here, watching a man worth hundreds of millions laughing it up with strangers who hadn't paid more than a few $100 for their tickets. And he realized, this seat didn't make him powerful. It just made him comfortable. And comfort wasn't the same as respect. His stomach twisted. Because he had spent so much of his life treating people like they didn't matter. All because he thought where they sat determined their worth. But Shaq, he sat where he wanted. And people respected him because of who he was, not where he was sitting. The thought burned. Because deep down, Adam knew, if their roles had been reversed, if Shaq had been the one mocking Adam for sitting in economy, Adam would have never forgiven him for it. But Shaq, he hadn't retaliated. He had just taught. And that was something Adam wasn't sure he could ever forget. Midway through the flight, Shaq stood up and made his way down the aisle, chatting with passengers as he passed. Adam watched as people's faces lit up, as Shaq's presence turned a cramped flight into something fun. He helped an elderly woman lift her bag into the overhead bin. He shared a private joke with one of the flight attendants. He even took a moment to sit next to a young man in a military uniform, thanking him for his service. And every single interaction was real. It wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It was just who Shaq was. Adam swallowed hard, staring down at the untouched drink in front of him. I had it all wrong. Power wasn't about being served. It was about serving others. And real leadership? It didn't come from status. It came from impact. And Shaq? He had more impact in a cramped economy seat than Adam had ever had with all the authority behind a gate agent's desk. Adam barely spoke for the rest of the flight. Not because he was angry, not because he was bitter, but because for the first time in his life, he was listening. Listening to the voices in his own head, the ones that had always told him that power meant being above people. Listening to the conversations around him, where passengers weren't just admiring Shaq for his fame, but for the way he made them feel. And mostly, listening to himself, asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. Who am I when I don't have status to hide behind? Because today, Shaq had taken that away from him, and Adam wasn't sure if he had anything left underneath. The seatbelt light flickered on, signaling their descent. Shaq made his way back to his seat, settling in for the landing. As the plane tilted slightly, he glanced over at Adam, studying him for a long moment. Then, in a voice calm but knowing, he said, "You good?" Adam didn't answer right away. Because the truth? He didn't know, for the first time in his life. He wasn't sure if he even knew who he was anymore. And that scared him more than anything. The plane touched down with a slight jolt, the cabin lights flickering on as the engines powered down. Adam sat still in seat 3A, staring at the seatbelt sign as if it held all the answers he had spent the last few hours searching for. He had boarded this flight as the same man who had laughed at Shaq's economy class ticket. But somewhere, between takeoff and landing, he had changed, or at least he wanted to. The real question was, could he? The sound of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts, gathering their bags, stretching their legs filled the air. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, thanking people for flying, offering polite smiles. Shaq, still squeezed into his economy seat, adjusted his massive frame, stretching his legs slightly before standing. Adam watched him for a long moment, debating whether to say anything. Then, finally, before Shaq could step past his row, Adam turned toward him and took a deep breath. "I was wrong about you." Shaq paused. Adam swallowed, forcing himself to hold eye contact. About everything. The words weren't easy to say, but they were true. Shaq studied him for a long second. His face gave away nothing. No smugness, no "I told you so," no superiority. Then, after a brief pause, he simply stuck out his hand. Adam didn't hesitate. He took it. The grip was firm, solid, but not overpowering. Just steady. Shaq nodded once, then let go, stepping into the aisle. No speech, no lesson. Because the lesson had already been taught. And now it was Adam's turn to decide what to do with it. As the plane emptied out, Adam found himself walking faster, catching up with Shaq just before they reached the terminal. "Hey," he called. Shaq turned, eyebrows raised slightly. Adam hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He had no idea why he felt so nervous. But then he forced himself to say it. "I want to transfer." Shaq's brow furrowed slightly. "Transfer?" Adam exhaled. "Yeah, I don't want to work the gate anymore." Shaq crossed his arms, watching him. "And where you trying to go?" Adam licked his lips. "Customer service." Shaq's expression didn't change. "Why?" Adam knew this was the real test. He could lie, say something about career growth, make it sound like he just wanted a change. But that wasn't it. And Shaq would see right through it if he tried. So for the first time in a long time, Adam spoke honestly. "Because I want to help people. Not just send them through lines like they don't matter." Shaq didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly, a small smile touched his lips. "You mean that?" Adam nodded. "Yeah." A beat of silence. Then Shaq clapped a massive hand on his shoulder. "Good. Then do it." And just like that, the decision was real. Adam had spent so long believing power was about status. Now, he realized it was about service. And that was something he could finally be proud of. The airport was alive with movement. Passengers rushing to their connections, families reuniting, employees pushing carts and calling out boarding information. Shaq walked through it without fanfare. No security detail, no entourage. Just a humble giant moving through the world like everyone else. Adam stood near the terminal entrance, watching as Shaq disappeared into the crowd. For the first time in his life, he saw greatness not in how much attention a man could command, but in how effortlessly he blended in. And somehow, that was the most powerful thing of all. What would you do if the person you underestimated held your entire future in their hands? Power isn't about status. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. Some lessons come easy. Others, you never see them coming. Stay sharp. Stay aware. Because the next time you judge someone too quickly, it might just be the biggest mistake of your life.